only 3 electoral votes in the first state. Delaware also drops into the Reagan column. Tennessee, the volunteer state, 11 electoral votes. Ronald Reagan rolls over Walter Mondale in Tennessee as well. Oklahoma, the Sooner state, 8 electoral votes there. Ronald Reagan has beaten Walter Mondale in Oklahoma as well. Kansas, the Sunflower State and one of the most Republican states in the Union, Ronald Reagan wins its 7 electoral votes. Missouri, the Show Me State, a border state where Walter Mondale thought he just might have a chance. 11 electoral votes at stake. Ronald Reagan wins those 11 electoral votes. North Dakota, the Sioux State, 3 electoral votes. Ronald Reagan, as expected, wins it. And in the District of Columbia, which was widely expected to go for Walter Mondale, it has gone for Mondale, and so Mondale gets on the board with 3 electoral votes from the District of Columbia. This is the way the map looks now. Southern states, Midwestern states are now moving on out into the Midwest, even the upper Midwest now. Every state that has reported thus far has gone to Ronald Reagan. Only the District of Columbia, with its 3 electoral votes, has gone to Mondale. Reagan, we estimate now, has at least 280 electoral votes. Remember, it takes 270 electoral votes to win. Walter Mondale has 3. In terms of the national vote, actual votes in and tabulated, 3% of the precincts reporting Reagan leads Mondale 62% to 38%. The Reagan tally is 1,730,000 votes. Mondale with just over 1 million votes. But remember, there are 538 electoral votes, and in the Electoral College is where it counts. Reagan is over the top with 280 of those electoral votes, we estimate. Now, Bruce Morton, not a surprising result, but how did the president fashion this victory?
Well, not surprising, Dan, maybe a little bigger than people thought. Of course, you could make the argument all he really needed to do was win Delaware. Delaware is never wrong. It's always with the winner. And Ed Rollins, the manager of the Reagan-Bush campaign, said at one point, listen, we just go and spread a couple of $1 million around Delaware. There's no way we can lose this thing. Seriously, I'd kind of like to turn that around a little and talk about what Walter Mondale tried to do. Mr. Reagan ran on peace and prosperity, and that's usually a winner. This is clearly a landslide. We don't yet quite know its geographic limits, but it'll be astonishing if the West turns around. That's been bedrock Republican territory for some elections past now. But we might take a look, based on our CBS News New York Times exit poll, at some of the groups Walter Mondale thought he might be able to get to come his way. First, young people. In fact, today, according to our poll, young people voted for the Reagan-Bush ticket. The Democrats had hoped that, as youth has in the past, it would vote Democratic this time. They hope that a lot of the younger, the upwardly mobile professionals, yumpies in that word we all heard so often this year, would object to the Jerry Falwell kind of conservatism, rules about abortion and school prayer and all that. In fact, about a quarter of Gary Hart's voters in the Democratic primaries voted for Ronald Reagan today. The Democrats have historically had the older voters worried about Medicare and Social Security. Mr. Mondale tried to make those issues, but those people went today for Ronald Reagan. Farmers, another group that once upon a time in Franklin Roosevelt's day used to vote pretty solidly Democratic, they today were for the Reagan-Bush ticket. Women, sick transit Gloria gender gap, I suppose, women voted Republican today. And Italian Americans, it was thought that if Geraldine Ferraro were a help anywhere, she would be a help with Catholics and Italian Americans. That didn't work either. As far as issues are concerned, Mr. Mondale spent a lot of his time talking about the deficit and the need to raise taxes to bring it down. Voters today said they didn't want to raise taxes to bring it down. They were on Mr. Reagan's side of that argument, and they also gave him credit as a strong leader. So you could argue, Dan, that the Mondale campaign tried to do 2 or 3 particular things. They thought they'd get credit for boldness by coming out in favor of raising taxes. That backfired. They thought that picking a woman for vice president, a truly bold stroke, might help them. It apparently didn't. They pinned a lot of faith on the debates. And people in our poll today just said the debates didn't make very much difference with them one way or the other. So the Mondale campaign took some gambles and lost.
Lost all of them except in the District of Columbia from the states reporting thus far, which reminds me, Bruce, and I know that you and I were just talking about this, that there's still a great deal at stake in those states where the polls are still open. When we encourage people to go out there and vote, it is a case that there's still a lot at stake. First of all, there is the question of how big a victory this is going to be. Ronald Reagan, his hopes for an unprecedented 50-state sweep, those hopes still alive and working. That's one big question, how big the win? The other big question, how long how powerful would the Reagan coattails be? He's got an avalanche going. Now, is he going to be able to pull in the wake of that avalanche some additional Republican senators in? The Republicans have control of the Senate. Is he going to be able to pull in an ideological majority in the House of Representatives? Now, that's where those states where the polls are still open in the Midwest and West can still make a tremendous difference.
CBS News coverage of Campaign 84 Election Night continues. From CBS News Election Headquarters in New York, here again is Dan Rather.
And good evening again. If today were a fish, Walter Mondale would throw it back in because the polls have closed in 41 states total. And in all 32 of them decided by this hour, all have gone to Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan, red on the map, Walter Mondale in blue. 352 electoral votes Ronald Reagan has, at least at this hour. CBS News estimates Ronald Reagan has 352. Walter Mondale has picked up only the District of Columbia. You see it blinking there at one point up in the right-hand part of your screen. Reagan 352, Mondale 3, with 270 electoral votes needed to win. Now, the questions, however, the questions that may very well be decided by the votes out here in the western portion of the country, in states, the Dakotas, Idaho, Utah, California, Hawaii, Alaska, Washington, Oregon. What may be decided out there is how big a mandate Ronald Reagan gets and whether indeed he gets a 50-state sweep. 26 votes in the House of Representatives, that's the magic number. Ronald Reagan would love to change the makeup of the House by 26 more Republican members or not. He gets that. He figures he'd have a working majority in the House. That may be decided by the votes that are still out in the western states. Very important votes. Every vote out there counts and matters a lot in the presidential race, in addition to all the others, because it may very well decide what kind of mandate and the size of the mandate that Ronald Reagan gets. Now, 3 more states have just dropped in to the Reagan column. Let's look them over. In Vermont, the Green Mountain State, which traditionally goes Republican, it has gone Republican. Ronald Reagan wins Vermont. Wisconsin, the Badger State, with 11 electoral votes and some of the best dairy cattle anywhere on the planet. Ronald Reagan wins it. None of the dairy cattle voted for him, but apparently a lot of other people did. A Reagan sweep in Wisconsin. And in New York. Read it and weep if you're a Democrat. 36 electoral votes, a state where Governor Mario Cuomo was trying to do it for Walter Mondale. Mayor Ed Koch in New York was trying to do it for him. Geraldine Ferraro, congresswoman from New York, was put on the ticket with hopes of holding New York for the Democrats. Ronald Reagan blows it all apart and carries the state of New York. Now, this is the way the national vote looks at this hour. A number of the votes are in and tabulated. The thousands are beginning to mount up now. 19% of the precincts reporting nationwide. Ronald Reagan leads Walter Mondale in these actually counted ballots, 60% to 40%. Reagan with just over 10.5 million votes among those counted thus far. Mondale with just over 7 million votes. Now, what we may be seeing here, and let's put the context to this, is Ronald Reagan becoming a kind of Babe Ruth of politics. The old Democratic coalition is gone, out of here. Ronald Reagan carried through the solid South, through the Midwest, the old Rust Belt where the unions used to be strong. Ronald Reagan carrying state after state in there. Now, we may be seeing an avalanche of historic proportions. The question, can Ronald Reagan carry 50 states, still very much up for grabs. So far, Ronald Reagan has only carried the District of Columbia. Ronald Reagan started the night with a Republican majority of 55 to 45 in the House of, in the Senate. The Democrats have picked up 1 in Tennessee, Albert Gore. And now the question becomes, does the Senate stay Republican? Looks like it probably will. And does Ronald Reagan get a working majority in the House? Well, that brings us to Jesse Jackson.